It is 9:31, so we are going to start our policy committee meeting for September 27th. We're going to start with 1.02, approval of the August 30th, 2023 policy committee meeting minutes. Motion?
Motion for approval. Second.
All right. All those in favor? Thank you, unanimous. For approval of our meeting minutes. We'll move on to 1.03, public comment. We have one individual who has signed up, Jennifer Walkman. Correctly. Our regular timer isn't working. You have three, well, it's not functioning this morning. It is working, I'm sure.
I'll have you in mind with that.
3 minutes, but I'm gonna set my phone
Okay.
timer, so you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is the correct forum, but my name is Jen Wagaman, and I have written to you a few times before, but wanted to reiterate some points prior to your workshop this afternoon regarding the redistricting. I am a teacher and a mother of two Frederick High School cadets. I live in the Whittier Community Planning Block 71. I appreciate the consideration and development of the additional alternative plans. As you go through and examine these options, I ask that you take into consideration the mental health of our students, especially our adolescents. This is not like any other redistricting plans. I'm sorry. This has the potential of impacting up to 2,799 children just trying to adjust to life after a worldwide pandemic. This is not an easy task for anyone, and it is unfortunate that any child would have to go through this. But as you work together to determine a solution, please consider the impact it will have on our middle schoolers and our high schoolers. Our current 9th grade students, my daughter for being one of them, had their first year of middle school on screens, not having the opportunity to make friendships and connections as they would in the school setting. They are just now developing these friendships, and in a year's time, they will be asked again to leave their friends and the comfort of their home school. As a teacher, I have seen how the pandemic has taken a toll on our students. I work every day on developing social skills, and we continue to do that. Coming back from the pandemic, I've watched as students didn't know how to interact with each other, the awkward conversations, the uncertainty on the playground, the confusion of what to do. We also need to take into account the huge impact this has had on their academics, and unfortunately, our test scores are showing it. As you are well aware, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey results are disconcerting and alarming for our adolescents. Our students are crying for help, and we need to listen. Research shows that the most common mental illnesses in teens are generalized anxiety, social phobias, and depression. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 24. The CDC reports that building strong bonds and connecting youth can protect their mental health. These strong bonds are being lost when redistricting happens. With the current options on the table, alternative 3 seems to be the best option for the least amount of students impacted. It is moving 201 students from Monocacy Middle to Crestwood. Although again, it's unfortunate for any student to endure, but the other options impact well over 1,000 students and up to almost 2,800 students. You get into being a mother, but I don't want to discredit the work that has gone into the current proposal and options, as I know there's much to be considered. However, I would like you to consider these 3 asks. 1, I ask that the appropriate resources such as administration, school counselors, psychologists, SROs be dedicated to this study to ensure that our children are in the best interest of any redistricting plan. You need professionals in these areas to weigh in on the impact and not just a committee of 3, although I do appreciate their time. I know, 2 more. Number 2, no matter what redistricting plan is approved, whether it be 200 students or almost 2,000 students, I ask that the plan be publicized and put in place well in advance of redistricting, with the appropriate resources being available to our children for this transition. This cannot be put on our teachers. We are not properly trained or equipped for this. And lastly, if the Whittier community needs to be split, are there plans to grandfather students in, and not just the seniors, the 8th graders, or the 5th graders? The current 9th graders are the ones that were hit hard for the pandemic, and we have much more vulnerable students due to the pandemic. Can we limit the amount of students this redistricting impacts? Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready?
Ready.
Okay, so I'm going to ask if with the committee's indulgence, that we go a little out of order this morning and take items 1.05 and 1.06 before 1.04. The request is based on scheduling conflict with Dr. Servo, who I want to make sure she's able to get to her meeting that she needs to be at following her attendance here. Okay.
She has my favorite color on.
Oh, yeah?
So therefore, yes.
You're a Notre Dame fan, aren't you?
Marshall University.
Marshall, okay. So we're going to start then with policy 109, ethics. This was brought back. This has been brought back to the committee at the request of the committee to address the post-board employment. But as you can see, having looked through it, there's a whole lot more that was done. And in part, the reason a whole lot more was done was because the next one, 1.06 on the agenda is policy 305. And what we are effectively doing is splitting the ethics policy in two, creating a board-specific policy and then a policy that addresses the employees, that focuses on conflict of interest and employee-related ethics issues. So a lot more was done to this for that reason. There are also some changes that were put in here after having sat down with the ethics panel and discussed the financial disclosures, some requests that were made by the ethics panel for clarification. And so I was able to incorporate those into this draft. And then I will also just headline this off with, I'm not going to be asking the committee today to act on this policy. I want to bring this back to the next board agenda, to the next policy committee agenda, because the ethics panel has asked for an opportunity to review this revised policy, and we are meeting next Thursday for that purpose. And so I want to hear what comments and edits they might want to propose as well, and bring those to the committee at the next meeting. So to take you through the policy, and of course we are adapting this to the new template. So we've created the policy purpose. We have updated the definitions. The identity is a new definition that is based off of the financial disclosures discussion, because we want to make sure that it is clear that when we ask for the identity, we're asking for the full name of the person and not just initials. Immediate family and qualified relative are actually elsewhere in the policy. Those are just relocations. If you scroll down to C on page 2, C3, here's where we clarify that this policy is for board members and candidates, and we articulate the cross-reference to new policy 305 for the ethical obligations for employees. Within the implementation, a little bit of cleanup. We've added that the posting of a panel opportunity to participate on the ethics panel can include a social media posting, not just website. And then a clarification in the voting. It was strange the way it was written, because it said that only 4 members of the ethics panel need to be present to have quorum, and then you need an absolute majority, and it in parenthetical said 4 votes. Well, if only 4 members are present for to be quorum, that would mean not absolute majority, that would mean 100% unanimity. So I clarify by striking 4 votes and just making it absolute majority of members of the panel present, which is actually the way Robert's rules instruct for the process of votes. And feel free, if you have questions, to interrupt me as I'm going.
A question on that. That makes logical sense, but I feel like it is, I did not know that was how Robert's rules function. I feel like we as a board have operated that we need 4 votes to pass, even if we had just 5 of us here. Am I correct that if we had 5 of the 7 of us here and something were to have support of 3 members, 3-2, it would not pass, that we need the 4 votes?
That is not the advice that I have given to President Johnson in the past. That if there are 4 members present, you would need 3 members to vote affirmatively, because 2 out of 4 is not a majority, right? It's not 50% plus 1, it's 50%. But if you had 5 members, it would still be a vote of 3 under Robert's rules.
And I will say what you're saying to me makes good logical sense. I think it is a change from what I've experienced earlier in my tenure on the board. But to me, what you're saying makes good logical sense, and if you have seen this in Robert's rules, I support it.
This is how Robert's rules would dictate it, but since this is coming back to the policy committee at the next meeting, I can follow up and see if I can dig out more into how we process votes as a board.
Okay.
All right, so I'm just taking my notes so I don't forget anything. If you move into the next section, which is the responsibilities, really this is just clarification, focusing on correct terminology, cross-referencing and linking the forms for requesting an advisory opinion and the form for requesting or for filing a complaint. You know, that's one of the big focuses that we have in the policy revisions, is making these documents cross-linkable. Under conflict of interest, the only change that you'll see is moving the definition of qualified relative. That's where it lived previously, and then just clean up, fixing cross references to the right section numbers, taking regulation out because this is not a regulation, this is a policy, and changing Board of Education to just board, since that's how we've defined you previously. If you skip down to the bottom of page 4, top of page 5, post-employment lobbying restrictions, this is what you had initially charged us with looking at. And this is what we are proposing, is that the 1-year restriction would remain if the position you're seeking to take is one that is on the executive leadership salary schedule, the administrative and supervisory salary schedule, or the administrative management and technical position salary schedule. Those are the positions that typically are the decision makers in the system. Any other position outside of those, so if you were moving to the FACE or the FCTA or to a substitute, those would be it would be only a 6-month waiting period. I think that's consistent with what the committee was looking for in terms of, balancing, the ability of someone to return and make a meaningful contribution to the system, while at the same time making sure there's sufficient distance between their service as a member of the board and their service as an employee.
I may ask a question after.
Okay, I will keep going. Let's see. So the next substantive set of changes go down to the financial disclosures, which is at the bottom of page, starting at the bottom of page 6. Just in the title itself, we're striking from the header all of the rest other than financial disclosures, because it only applies to board members and candidates, and we've said that earlier, so I didn't feel it was necessary to restate that. And if you get all the way down to the bottom of page 8, interests in corporations and partnerships, one of the clarifications that the ethics panel noted was that mutual funds do not need to be identified in the stock ownership. That section is intended if you own directly a stock. So if you own shares of Microsoft or Bank of America, who we may do business with. But owning a mutual fund that is an index fund that covers all 500 stock in the S&P 500, that's not what was intended by this, and that's not what the ethics panel is looking for. And so they asked if we could just clarify that in this section. So the remaining changes in this section under the financial disclosures look like changes, but they're really not. The blue text in, if you're looking at the red line, under interest in corporations and partnerships, the A and the B, that's just rewriting what was in a different way, what was there previously, and relocating it so it flows better. And that's the same change in relationships with the University of Maryland Medical System, indebtedness of entities. None of this is new. This is all what's been in there previously. It's just reincorporated in a slightly different way, because I don't do bullets. You can't reference bullets. I can't say to you, look to little I bullet number 3. That's cumbersome. It's easier to just say, look to little I what. And so I had to rewrite it in a little bit of a way to make it fit in, but the content is the same as it was previously. Scrolling down, we strike from this section the financial disclosures for employees because we're moving that to 305. And we are striking the exemptions and modifications paragraph because then that too applies to employees. And the board's ability to grant an exemption or a modification to an employee, there was no such intention in the way it's written that there could be an exemption or a modification for a member of the board. And so that's been moved into policy 305 as well. And those are the changes. I mean, that's the sum and substance of it up until the point where the ethics panel comes back and says, we want to make some revisions to this, that, or the other. I'm open to questions.
Well, just to quickly, since it's the one thing that we originally started down this road, on that change regarding employment post-board, it says employed 1 year, correct?
We're going to get back to
Members of the board may not be employed for at least 1 year. Board member, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I haven't got to the question.
Oh, okay.
it says may not be
in this-
employed for a period of 1 year if you're in one of these positions.
So I guess this maybe when you take it back to ethics, they can be interviewed
Oh, interesting.
with a start date,
So the question is, can they apply for
Correct.
employment?
Oh,
because we're saying employed,
Mhm.
so therefore could they interview at 9 months with a start date of,
That's interesting. My inclination would be that they can't even apply for anything,
so maybe we should.
right? Because the idea is, how do you create a clearer boundary between service and employment?
So maybe we should say that.
Yeah, that would make more sense. That's a great point.
Yep.
May not seek employment.
Yeah.
Seek or gain employment or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I can see that hitting a roadblock when it goes
Yeah,
before
yeah.
before the board. 'cause I
It would
know
allow
there's
them to
some
start
people
seeking
feel strongly
employment
about
at a
that.
6-month period, even if the start date, right? So arguably, if you think about the cycle of a board member, let's say you exit office in December, you could start applying for jobs by the following June or July if you wanted to be a teacher, which would be plenty of, which
Correct.
would be on the later side, but still time enough
Yes,
for us to hire you
Yes.
and for you to start in the fall.
right.
Yeah.
But I think there needs to be that
Mhm.
delineation to where
Mhm.
one of the big ones we're talking about is AMT and
Right.
supervisory roles. Because we wouldn't want them interviewing in August for a January 1 start date.
Yeah, that makes
Because
sense.
that hits right at the year.
Yeah,
No.
that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
Some questions.
Sure.
For the financial disclosures, how much of this is guided by state law and how much of this do we have discretion on as a local board?
99% of it is guided by state law. There is not a lot of discretion in terms of what can be, what are the things that the what disclosures are being made. That's coming almost straight out of the law.
Second question, so this is listed as an action item. Are there any implications, negative implications for us not taking action on this and waiting for the ethics panel to give further thoughts?
No, because this committee, the three of this committee in particular, has had before it action items in the past that the decision was bring it back. You need to do more work. The political activity policy 314. That one came back several times, and each time it was presented as an action item. So there's no implication in it being listed as an action item, and then the panel deciding to wait so the ethics panel can weigh in.
After that.
Yeah,
Right.
and now the language changed.
Mhm.
Correct.
I guess my third question is more substantive. Mr. Rose, I think you made a good suggestion on it's even the application that should have some delay. So that I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I remain concerned about the quick turnaround of 6 months. Am I of 6 months between being a board member and then being able to take most roles within FCPS. I want to make sure I understand previous discussions. Is our desire with this change to meet the needs of, we have some open teaching positions, we have some open bus driver positions, SCIAs, many positions are open. Is that generally speaking, either for my colleagues or for staff, is that what you would say is really driving this 6-month rather than year delay?
It is largely the delay that's created by waiting a year, because for many of the positions, it's not waiting a year, it's waiting 18 months. And it means that an individual who could fill and ably fill a teaching position, or in particular a special education teaching position, because we know those are always in demand, right? That's a year lost, and that's not to the benefit of the students.
It would be 2 years lost because they'd come off the board in December. They couldn't do anything and they could not work again then for almost 2 years. It would be an 18-month delay on starting employment. This gets us closer to like a 9 or 10-month delay.
And I think the original intention was to look at where our critical staffing needs are within the system and recognizing that, we want this. I mean, I really appreciate the language in here of the, executive leadership and AMT, because those are areas where board members would potentially have a lot of influence in that process, and their higher pay scales typically.
Right.
But this would allow a prior board member to fill into some of those critical staffing positions. I think Dean talked about coaching previously, like you couldn't even be a coach coming off the board, and so a year seemed like.
Well, because it ends up being more than a year. It ends up
But
being
when
18
you
months.
consider what season you might coach, it can
Right.
be 2 years.
Right.
Correct.
I mean, it just, because, again, researching, going back, I think the spirit of this initial language was 2 things. One, obviously, is if a board member ever came off and took a cabinet level position.
Right, that would look
Yeah.
like quid
That
pro
would
quo.
look really
You would want
bad.
to avoid
And
that,
then
right?
I think the spirit of this one almost was the board created an administrative level position within the by board rule and then filled it with a board member.
Right.
And that left a really
And
bad
that's not an
taste.
area of
Yeah.
staffing need for us.
That's really a conflict. I mean,
Right,
think
right.
about that. You're a member of a board, you vote in a budget to
Right.
create a position, and
Right.
then you fill that position. That's a real I can see why that raised the hair on some people
Oh, yeah.
about that. So, and I think we addressed that by the 1 year being able to apply. That doesn't change anything.
So this leads to my final question. Is there value in waiting more than a year for AMT level positions, for that kind of senior staff, that kind of responsibility? I would argue that 1 year is insufficient. I would support a longer delay to avoid any semblance of conflict of interest. The 1 year, I don't think is sufficient for those higher paid and higher influence positions.
My opinion is that a year is long enough in terms of, like, the board member has exited, they no longer have any presumed influence over the system or hiring, and they become part of an applicant pool, and perhaps they're a highly qualified applicant, and perhaps they're not, but there's enough distance, I feel like, in a year that there would be no perceived influence or conflict, ethical conflict, in them coming back, potentially, if they're the highest. So to me, that application of a year is sufficient.
You would have stepped off and not voted on a budget
Right.
that would impact your employment.
Correct.
the subsequent budget would be after you've left the board.
Mhm.
And I don't, just for the discussion, what raised this isn't the fact that people were waiting out the year and joining administration. What brought it was, we have teachers' positions, bus
Correct.
drivers' positions, coaching positions, SEIA positions that need filled. And on at least one occasion, we've had a board member not only show interest, but took a job in another.
Yeah, I would say sort of with generalizing, typically the sort of service cycle that you see that is more typical is that someone leaves the school-based or classroom position and becomes a board member, and then would go back to said position possibly or potentially. But I'm not even aware in any recent history of board members going into senior level or cabinet positions locally or even at the state level.
I think we found out there
unusual.
are only, 9 districts that even have this language in there.
Yeah. it's
And
unusual.
that's what I was going to suggest. Since we do have the luxury of bringing this back to the October meeting, let me do some research and see what other LEAs have in terms of their restrictions on returning to employment, if there are any. And I can come back with a survey of other LEAs
Across the state or nationally?
across the state. I mean, I can go bigger if you want me to go bigger, but I mean, I feel like we compare ourselves to our peers. I mean, I can include, Northern Virginia.
I'm not looking to create a large scope of work on this. So, within reason, if
Sure.
Northern Virginia makes it, then perhaps. Yeah, I think that's an important data point. I continue to feel we have a role as a board that puts us both in terms of hiring and supervising the superintendent, and with the budget that I think it would be a really bad look, even 12 months later, for someone to leave the board and then be hired by the superintendent into a senior level position. And so I'm unlikely to support this policy with the language as is. So yeah, I want to state that.
Well, so assuming as things go as I hope they do tonight with policy 114 being approved, one of the data points I would have to be providing as part of the policy analysis is what other LEAs have anyway.
Yes.
So you're not asking me to do anything that I wouldn't already probably have to
Sure.
go back and do.
And for this language, there's no rush.
Right.
No one's stepping off in December.
Right.
So,
And beyond, I think, Mr. J and Ms. Yoho, there's no other certificated members of the board. Right? And so that's the other piece. Most of these positions are certificated by the state of Maryland, so you can't just,
right.
I mean, beyond maybe perhaps seeking a substitute position or a paraeducator position, there's also a limited set of individuals who could even meet the minimum qualifications
Right.
to apply to these positions.
Right.
You have to keep that in
So
mind.
there's no, like I said, it's a year from December before
Right, most of the,
anyone.
particularly to your point,
potentially
most
step
senior level executive and other positions require a degree of experience in public education and a certification, not all are certificated, but many do, that you may not necessarily find in the typical board member as well. So I just think it's a small data set.
So just one note about wording. The phrase candidates to be members of the board, which is used throughout this entire policy, is a little bit lengthy. It just sounds a little wonky. Can we say board candidates?
We can.
rather than-
Yeah.
I mean, it's throughout, so I started highlighting.
We'll find and
some, but
replace.
Just, it makes those sentences
Yeah,
just
for
sound
sure.
a little-
Sense.
Anything else?
So the only other change that I think I'm going to present when we bring this back is I may retitle this from ethics to board ethics, just to help keep that clarity
Yeah,
between the
makes
two
sense.
policies. All right, so that brings us then to policy 305, and I have to tell you, I'm really excited about policy 305.
Oh, thank you, sir.
off.
That's where we're at now in our work. We just get excited. We're little policy heads over here.
Policy wonks go.
I know
Oh,
we are. I mean, I did get my PhD in policy studies. I'll admit, I'm a little nerdy about policy, so.
I am a policy wonk too in this respect. No, what I'm excited about is that we're creating some real clear guidelines in a single place that our employees will be able to look to understand what the expectations are of them. And the first time I read 109, and it was clear to me that 109 was intended for the board members, and then employees kind of got shoehorned into it. And so the idea that we've put together a brand new policy that is really identifying a gap in the policies that the board had implemented, I think is kind of exciting.
Yes.
I'm a policy nerd.
We
What
enjoyed
can I
working
say?
on it together is what he's trying to say.
So let me walk you through it. Actually, I'm going to let Dr.
Sure.
Sergo walk you through it because she did the lion's share of the work. It does incorporate deactivated policies, and in this particular one, I didn't highlight where, but we can try and
Sure,
do so. if
I'll
it's
make
not
sure to point
obvious.
that out. So this builds off of some previous conversations we had at the last policy committee meeting. That was about, we had these sort of one-offs, like they were policies that were a couple sentences in length. One about tutoring, we had one about, I think, nepotism, and then we had what we described as policy gaps, things that were just not addressed in any way. We also had a really rich discussion with the policy committee about the copyright and royalties. And so the interest of this was, I think, the task that what we were tasked with was, how can we put this together in a comprehensive document that will give a really solid anchor to our employees about the expected code of conduct. So we decided to name this policy Conflict of Interest in Employee Ethics, because it sort of gives both the guardrails of what is and isn't permitted, but also talks about places that you want to avoid the suggestion of impropriety, which isn't to say it suggests you are unethical, but is to say, here are some places where you might want to consider. So in terms of, without going into the definitions in the policy statement, which I think sort of speak for themselves, talk a little bit about implementation. Supervisory expectations is the language that comes from the nepotism policy. And so what this really talks about is that employees cannot supervise people who are members of their family, right? And so we talk about that being a spouse, a relative, an in-law, right? You're not to supervise them. That's not a new topic or concept, and it is reflected here. In addition, in terms of financial payment, talks about this idea around tutoring. And so the note, this is again, not a new concept, just wordsmithed and sort of polished a bit, which is that you really shouldn't be working for money for any students that really attend your school, right? The idea is I can tutor. We have a lot of wonderful teachers who serve as tutors, but that important idea of, but not anyone who I have any particular influence, right? So the sort of, when you always have to think about, well, why would that be? The counter argument of why this is important is, maybe I don't give you a good grade, and then I suggest to you, you really should benefit from some tutoring, and lucky you, I tutor, and I only charge $25 an hour. So it sort of protects the employee from any allegations that they've created business for themselves or created any influence, not only for a student that they teach directly, but is in their school in any way.
Ask the question.
Sure. That's good. I thought I brought my glasses, but I didn't. Go ahead.
Alright.
Oh, they're right here. There you go.
So I understand
Mhm.
this. As a parent, though, I think about the relationships that
Mhm.
my kids have with their teachers
Mhm.
and how, for at least one of my kids, how that relationship through a potential like extension through summer tutoring, for example, might help her to advance in some of the areas where she's really struggled. And then the basis of that is in the relationship that she has developed with some person.
We would want her to access tutoring that we are paying the teacher to provide. So when we think about the benefits that we give, tutoring, and we've had lots of discussions. If you talk about live tutoring, we have had historically, and certainly the board could invest even more deeply in this idea of having money where we could pay our teachers to tutor. It's the idea of the private relationship, the idea of there being any suggestion by a teacher that their family should pay them money beyond a free and appropriate public education to teach their child. And that could be a very dangerous space for our teachers to enter into, and there could be a suggestion of impropriety in that relationship. It's a pretty typical policy across the country around tutoring.
I understand. Like,
I get it. No, I'm the
board
same way.
that, I
Yeah,
understand.
and I have a daughter who during the pandemic, through the CARES tutoring, was tutored by her homeroom teacher, and it was incredibly powerful. So it's not about that you can't tutor, it's that I wasn't paying for that. The school district was paying that teacher directly, and so that's the distinction.
I understand. And I think what makes it even more challenging is that, we as a board had to make a decision to cut summer program funding for the upcoming summer. My daughter took advantage of that this past summer, but we
Correct.
don't have that available. We won't unless
So let's-
the board finds.
Let's
But I
come
just-
back, no, I want to hold on to it, so let's
Yeah.
come back to when we get into item 7, because this is really about, number 2 isn't directly about tutoring, number 7 is. This is just in general, that they're not supposed to be accepting money from people as employees, not as a gift, just in general to do things. So let me walk it through, and then I want to come back to it.
Yeah, and I think it's not just about my kid, obviously, right? But I think a lot of parents would have that same,
Yeah.
relationship
Sure,
that is developed
right.
might help their child. So,
Yeah, and I think the challenge again is, if the teacher is the one responsible for identifying that there's a need, and then saying, well, I can help you with this need, but I can't do it during my duty day, you can pay me, $40, $50 an hour to help address this, but you get me for free during the day. It's a boundary that could create some challenges.
And it would apply, and there's more circumstances than just tutoring where
Yeah.
it would apply. I think the football coach who does private
Positioning.
lessons for the quarterback, and then in exchange for that money, that quarterback is going to be the starter, right? I mean, that's it's not
Broader than
tutoring per
tutoring.
se, but it's the same concept, that we want to avoid that appearance that that puts our staff in the position of, I've accepted money, now I'm going to give a benefit to an individual student.
Right, or I created additional funding stream for myself. So I took coaching and made it even, another thing.
And you want us to save that question for,
Because I think some of it'll tie together.
gotcha.
Gifts, this is language that's existed. You're basically not supposed to accept gifts or solicit gifts
Yeah,
in any way.
Dr. Sergo
Yeah.
tried to abbreviate this, and this is one of those sections, Mr. Bass, that is prescribed in the law. Like
Yeah.
we put it back, this matches what's in the board's ethics policy.
Right, so it's sort of, if you look at item C on page 3, it does list the things where you can accept a gift, what we call in kind, and of course, in some in monetary value. So, you can be given meals and ceremonial gifts and awards. You can also accept, gifts of $20 per family. I know as a parent myself, I used to always say everybody could put in $20 for the teacher gift and things of that nature. And other sort of things that there are some exceptions that don't apply, and those are listed, but again, these are all from the law directly, and it's really, again, about same thing with the financial payment above. It's really about anything that could suggest that it would impair the impartiality of the employee to make decisions or to exercise their judgment as an employee. So that language is not new, it's from the law.
do the Amazon wish lists
Oh,
fall under this category, or would that be?
it's an interesting question. This
So
is.
are the Amazon wish lists
They're not-
being used for teachers to get supplies for the classroom?
They're considered donations, and some believe it's a gift.
I just found out that the teachers of the PTA, PTO.
Some
So
teachers post them
teachers
on
post
social
Both of
media.
those things happen.
Yeah.
The PTO, the schools will sometimes send them out on behalf of the PTO, but what I'm referring to is the Amazon wish lists that are created by individual teachers. But they are supplies for classroom.
My gut reaction is that if it's supplies for the classrooms, it's probably okay, because it's just articulating a specific need for the in terms of this policy. Now, whether we should be allowing that and not having that run through the principal and the availability of supplies that the principal can offer, that's a different discussion. But in terms of this policy, if it's intended for the classroom, my gut is that it's probably okay.
Right, not for the employee.
Yeah, but if it's my personal wish list that I would really like, a new coffee mug, that's a different discussion.
But I'm not sure if that falls under this policy or not, but at the
We
beginning
need
of the school year, there was
There was.
uh,
Let me look into that. No, because I think that, that we need to probably land somewhere and have policy language to go with it around this, because this is the norm, right? I see them in my Facebook feed,
Mhm.
teachers, they're, please help me out, and, and so, I think that there's an opportunity for us to land
Yeah.
somewhere. So let's do some research on that. I think that's a great idea.
Thank you.
In terms of conflicts of interest, essentially this is the idea of they're really making sure that you don't engage in any decision-making for which you cannot be impartial. And so there's a number of examples. Again, I think most of these come from the law, but this idea of if I have something personal to gain by a decision that's being made, I have to really recuse myself.
And this matches what's in the board's policy.
Correct. Item 5, which is about employment, financial business entities, it's sort of an elaboration on that same topic, which is if I have a business and said business is trying to do business with the system, with the board, again, I have to make sure that I am not in any employment relationship that makes it difficult for me to be impartial. There is an exclusion here for ministerial duties, right? So people who might have that type of a relationship, but you're not supposed to be engaged or participate in a business entity if there is any potential for prospective employment proposals or contract reward.
And the language in D under 5D procurement, that's not something that's in the board's policy, I don't believe. I think this is something that, in our discussions, we said, hey, this actually could become an issue as, we have a lot of individuals who assist us in developing our RFPs and the bid proposal documents. And to have that person involved in the process of developing the bid and then submitting a bid seemed like a very clear conflict that we wanted to articulate.
In terms of item 6, this is, I think, again, a standard one in a conflict of interest policy, which is you cannot share information that you gain through your employment for your own benefit, economic or otherwise. And so that's a pretty traditional one. So this is where we go back to tutoring more specifically. So this language, for the most part, comes from our existing tutoring policy, which is number 1, the obvious, which is has to occur outside your workday, not while we're paying you to do your job. And it's sort of item B, I think, Ms. Gallagher speaks to your point. There is a conflict of interest that can be created if a parent and staff members are contracting for services. So this is the way that these requests would be governed, that they're not supposed to tutor anybody who attends or might attend their school where they work, that they can't do that tutoring in our building. So they can't take advantage of our resources or use our materials. And they can't advertise. So you can't take your class parent list and say, hey, just an FYI, if you're interested, I also tutor part-time. I tutor in the summer. And they cannot, of course, in any way, and I think this is less likely given some of our programming, but sort of use what they understand to know about program admission to try to help someone get, I know I can help you, prepare you to take that exam to get into that Academy of Fine Arts or whatever, if there was a program like that was admissions based. Well, we don't have a lot of those now, or any really, there could be a time in the future where we do. This is really prevalent in districts that have magnet programs or other types of programs where there are tests to get into them, and there's a whole cottage industry around people trying to prep kids to get into those programs. There are 2 exemptions, Ms. Gallagher. One is about people who are working in programs for students with disabilities. Because of the staffing need in that area, we would allow them to have the superintendent can guarantee and can offer an exemption there, or any of our partnerships. So let's say I'm a 10-month teacher. In the summer, I work for Boys and Girls Club, and I'm working with some of our students who are in my building. That would be an exemption because they're one of our partners and they're serving our kids and they're being paid for that. Thoughts? Does that address some of the questions you had about the tutoring?
So I just want to throw another scenario out there that 2 and 7 combined are intended to address. I don't know if you recall a few years ago, there was the scandal about the college admissions, people getting things padded on their high school resumes, tests being taken for them, people on tennis teams that weren't actually tennis players. I mean, and that all comes down to, you know, the individuals in the classroom or the staff who run those programs saying, you know what, I'm going to say, okay, Dr. Sergo, you give me $5,000 and I'll make your kid will be the next editor-in-chief of the yearbook. And those, I mean, we
It's
kind of
obvious,
like
but right.
we say this as like, how could that possibly ever happen? But then we saw what happened, you know, just a few years ago over in California,
Right.
and it was
exactly.
big business. It was big business.
This does bring up, just the clarification, particularly on those sections. If a teacher takes a summer position at a company,
Mhm,
say Mattopia,
mhm.
can one of their students enroll at Mattopia and be tutored by that teacher?
My initial reaction to that would be yes, because the parent is paying the company and the
Not the
company has
individual.
hired the
Okay,
employee.
as
The
long as they're
employee
not
has
being
no,
paid individually.
right, as long as
That's-
it's not a private relationship
Gotcha.
between a
Correct.
parent,
Okay.
that there's a third party. The teacher had no, now, listen, I mean, you could get an ethics fight. Someone could say, well, the teacher told me that they work at Mathtopia and they suggested, you know, those would come before the ethics panel if there was that kind of
Because
an
that would fall
allegation.
under the advertising.
Yeah.
Advertising. I can't
Correct.
help you after school, but this summer
But I work at
Mattopia.
Mattopia.
You know,
Right,
like
that's
I
where
get
you
that.
kind of have a little bit more of a challenge, because even though I'm not directly receiving the benefit, you're not paying me directly, I'm encouraging you to come to my summer employer who is paying me. And, you know, if I bring a lot of my students to the summer academy or summer program, will my employer give me a little bit extra because I brought in all this new business, right? Like, so there is some more, I still have some concern about that kind of scenario, but ultimately I think Dr. Sergo is correct that it's not a direct financial
As
relationship.
long as they're not involved in the process that refers students to that, right? So if I say, you know, I really think my daughter needs some support in summer, what would you recommend? I would hope that an employee in that crafting that response who might work there would say, there's a variety of places you could go. I wouldn't offer, and here's where I go. I'd say, there are a variety of things available. I can have, you know, I think we have some resources on our website and you can look at them and pick one that you think works best for your family versus somehow engaging in a directed recruitment. See what it's sort of,
Yeah.
you have to be smart as an employee in any suggestion of impropriety. So giving people information, but not recruiting or referring them.
So what I want to do is I want to make sure we're not continuing to muddy the water. I want to make sure we're providing clarity to our teachers, coaches, employees. And of course, as a former coach, it brings to my mind, what if I run a summer camp?
Yep.
They
And
can come to your camp.
My players come to my camp.
so I think, Mr. Rose, you must have been reading my mind, because I wrote in my notes, clarify the tutoring question and what the staff can do and what they can't.
Yeah,
And
we'll
bring
make
that
this
back,
one.
bring that
Yeah.
back when we come back next
And,
month.
and, and how we can make it easy for them to find out, is this okay? Because I mean, for me, from a coaching perspective, that's a big one. Because we have summer camps for basketball, baseball,
Right.
football, soccer, every sport we know. And our coaches operate those camps.
Right.
And
Mhm.
typically they operate them under some LLC, but they are receiving payment. And typically they also,
Are they requiring students to go to the summer camp?
not requiring,
Okay, that's
But-
good.
It certainly helps.
certainly helps, but they have them. And then they also employ coaches from the other schools who are then employed
Yeah.
under that camp. Kind of a quid pro. I work the camp at Linganore, the Linganore coach works the camp at Urbana, and vice versa. But that's all over the county. And
Yeah,
it's
we're not
commonplace.
trying to hurt our ability of our employees to extend themselves and provide services that families want, whether it be in athletics or academics or things. So I think
And that's why I want to provide clarity.
yeah,
because
let's
I
make
don't
this, we
want
can
there
make
to
this
be
better.
That.
Yeah, I think we can make this better. This was very much what we inherited. But I think even in the research, this is pretty consistent, perhaps intentionally vague, perhaps, some might argue, to not be overly restrictive because there's so many scenarios. A lot of what we see in looking at other policies is very specific to the notion of targeted recruitment for personal gain. So I think how can we illustrate how an employee can continue to do these great things that kids want, that families need, but not have any suggestion that they have engaged in recruitment or referral for personal financial gain. That's inherently what makes it a conflict.
And then I would just want to make it very easy for our teachers, coaches, employees to ask, is this, like I said, because my mind's
an
reeling
opinion.
with the coaching thing, because I'm
Right.
aware of pitching. I know
Yeah,
coaches who then do pitching coaching in the summer
Oh, yeah.
for their own pitchers.
right,
And
yeah,
they accept compensation for that.
right. Let's look at
So
that.
I want to make it easy,
No, I hear you. I think those
therefore
are good
easy for them to
scenarios.
say, who do I file this with to get approval to?
Right, and maybe that's what we need. We need some layer to give them an advisory opinion.
Yes.
In terms of those clarifications, I think the example Ms. Gallagher brought up needs to be brought up as well, that if a family is feeling that their child's teacher is going to be the best tutor, and it's initiated by the family, not by the teacher themselves, is there a way that that can be done?
So currently that would be, this isn't new, so that would be currently that's not permitted. So you would be proposing that we allow staff to tutor students who they directly work with, which would be highly unusual for a conflict of interest policy, but we can certainly look for places where they've created, I don't know, some guardrails that allow for variations of that under certain circumstances. We'll just have to look for some.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as we come back with revisions next month to this, I mean, my staff will spend some time pouring through opinions of the State Ethics Commission and seeing, certainly, I can't believe we're the first to come up with these questions.
Right.
Someone else has thought of these
Right.
before and
I
has
just look at,
addressed
I
them.
look at, like, in this example, I look at, like, let's say, Butterfly Ridge, where the teacher's from Butterfly Ridge, the student loves that teacher, in the summer, that teacher tutors. But we're saying that student can't go get tutoring from that teacher. But a student from Hillcrest could.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is also on the flip side is teachers feeling pressured to tutor at the request of parents. So it insulates them from that. So for example, if a parent says, I think my kid needs more. And now this isn't necessarily just for kids who are struggling. As a former principal, I often heard from my families who wanted enrichment and acceleration, and they wanted the teacher to do more. And so the others, if a parent would go to a teacher and say, my kid needs more, they're not getting enough during the day, I'll pay you, but I want you to work with them every day after school and do enrichment. This gives the teacher the boundary to say, I'm not permitted to do that. Right, so it's sort of, I think we all come to it as like the spirit of support, right? Like we're thinking, how can we help kids, right? But but there is this other perspective that could open us up to that we have to be mindful of.
I
I
think
just
we-
worry about the specifics of excluding a child because they have a relationship with that teacher at that school, and then a child from another elementary school can take advantage of receiving that tutoring.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to go back and take another look at this. And I mean, there's another scenario that comes to mind that we haven't even discussed. When my son was born, he was in a private pre-K, and we hired one of the teachers at his school who was part-time to be a mommy's helper and come to my home. And we did that specifically because he was in her classroom and she came and helped his mom out. And that's not tutoring. That's not giving anybody a beneficial advantage. They're not going to be the quarterback. Maybe they'll be the quarterback, but at the same time, we do have staff who are part-time and.
My kids were at a child care center where we were told when we signed them up, the staff are not allowed to babysit your children. So I think there are lots of different issues here. So we want to get it right. We want to get it right in service of kids.
Yeah.
We don't want to create a situation where we can't do for kids what they need.
Okay.
but we also need to make sure that we insulate our employees appropriately, so.
What I definitely
More
like
to
in here is an ease for our employees to check.
Yes, right, that, we'll get this better, we'll make it better.
Thank you.
Definitely more to be done.
Thank you.
So the next items, 8 and 9, is related to us massaging the copyrights and royalties content. And so we added a section on intellectual property, but I'm gonna walk through item 8 first, which is the idea of copyright. So we call this development of materials, supplies, there's a common mistake. Material supplies, well, there's an extra word. Supplies, equipment, or materials created by an employee. And hopefully we got this right, but based on the interest of the committee. We know that we want employees to be using materials that are consistent with board policy. You know, I think this is a common thing you see in policies now, the internet, teachers pay teachers, there's lots of things out there that in the interest of expediency and efficiency, I think I got my own children through the pandemic by accessing teachers pay teachers. There's lots of great resources, but you do have to be a really astute consumer of those resources and make sure that you aren't using things that are introducing topics or instructional approaches that are not consistent with board policy. And so this sort of highlights that. You can create things, you're not mandated to use a scripted sort of set of materials, but whatever you do has to align with our instructional philosophy and our board policy. The other thing is, if we were to have perhaps be in the business of purchasing something, a former employee being the editor or creator of something doesn't preclude us from purchasing it, as long as it was, we still are selecting materials appropriate with our procurement process. If an employee is in the position of making a procurement or materials decision and they have any relationship with the person who created it, they should be recusing themselves from that. So I feel like that's pretty obvious. And then we get into item D. That is anything that is created either by an employee on their own or with a group by which the materials of our system have been used still belongs to the employer. So that's sort of the simplicity of it. Item 9 gets into this topic we started to talk a little bit about, which is the idea of intellectual property. This was a fascinating section to research and think about because, to your point, Mr. Rose, we pour into our employees and we love when they grow and they get better and they have interest and they want to expand their influence and they may be writing books or they may be doing presentations and we don't want to get in the way of them spreading their knowledge and their expertise. So we looked at how we could bolster this section to allow that to happen in an appropriate way. So what we're saying, number one, is we don't prohibit people outside their time working with us, using their own research, their resources, all those things to make things that they own, that they've created. That is their intellectual property. And if it is done in sort of we call it a derivative way, it's directly related to what they've done as an employee, we do own that, right? Like it's part of what we've invested in, we've paid for those resources and those materials. That's the point at which we own it. Otherwise, if they've created it by themselves, if they have in some way, it could be related to their employment, but it isn't something they've created, they may just really need to request an opinion of the advisory panel to say, I wrote this book about human resources. And, I gained most of my knowledge from being the chief over human resources, but I've also done my own learning and research and all that. And so I sort of have a bit of it that came from my work experience, but a bit that really comes just from me. I'd love to publish this work. Do you think that's okay? And so what we're adding here is we can't possibly come up with all the scenarios where intellectual property might come into play. So we're asking people to just get an advisory opinion, which will place the employee in a position where someone can make a ruling that they then can say this was allowed.
To piggyback on that, we're also asking that they start off by having a meeting with the superintendent or the superintendent's designee to share that, hey, look, I've identified this gap in your curriculum, and I think I can write a program for it. I want to do it on my own time, with my own money, with my own research, but I identified it out of my work. Let's have that conversation first before you even have to go to the ethics panel, because it may be that, you know, we've identified that same gap and we have our own staff working on that. And so I can say to you, hey, you know, you've come and met with me. Thank you for telling me that you have this idea. We're already addressing it. We've got a team of people working on this already. And you were welcome to do what you want to do, but, you know, we're already addressing this, and maybe you don't want to spend your time on this. So we are asking that they have a conversation with the superintendent or the designee first. This is not this is not something that came whole cloth out of my brain. We did look at other LEAs, and this is a piece of one of the other LEA's policies.
Because the gray area is really spoken to in item D, which is the notion of something being partially public and partially private, right? And so it's difficult. There has to be a dialogue and a very specific conversation related to the materials being created to know where it should land. But I think we benefit from a branding perspective and an organizational perspective, supporting the ability of our employees to cast a wide net, to share their expertise, to contribute to the field of education. But we want to do so in a way that is boundaried and is clear, as to not suggest anything improper. Like, oh, they wrote that book on FCPS's time and now they're getting all this money for it. These are extreme examples, but sort of that's the intent.
And
Intellectual property.
Part of the guidelines and protections we put in there is if you come to us and you say, hey, I'm interested in doing this, and we say, sure, that makes sense, but you're going to be using part of, you know, your FCPS facilities of property knowledge, we'll come back with a written agreement that's going to spell out, here's the expectations, here's the rights. So we will have a unique agreement for each individual that will be very clear, so everyone understands what the expectations are and what your rights are and who owns what piece of what. And you know, that too is something borrowed from another LEA. It also keeps me in business, so I got to say I like that. But the truth is, it's that need for a written agreement is there to protect everybody.
You feel like we hit the interest?
I think you've hit on a lot of important areas here. That agreement would be in conversation between the employee and the superintendent and the superintendent's designees. How would this look?
So the superintendent's designee and the employee would sit and meet. They would have the conversation about the need, the interest, what it is the employee is looking to do. A decision would be made between them that, you know, this is, yes, you can proceed with this work that you're doing, and because you're going to be doing something that involves our FCPS's, you know, property or facilities or resources, you know, we're going to refer this over to legal services, and they're going to put together an agreement that's going to outline all of our understandings. What can you use? How often can you do it? You know, if it's something you are physically constructing, because we kind of think of this in terms of copyright, but it could also be something in terms of a patent, right? If I physically construct something new, but I'm using I
don't know. What are you
No,
talking about? Like
not a
like
laboratory,
3D
but-
printer?
Yeah, so if you use our 3D, that's a great example. That's not what I was thinking, but that's a great example. If you use one of our new 3D printers that we got through the Ripken Foundation, you know, well, when can you use that? The written agreement would spell that out. You can't use that during this time period because this is when it must be available for students, but we can make it available to you on, you know, after school from the hours of 4 to 5, or, you know, whatever. We can work out those details, but that's, Mr. Bass, how I would envision that working.
And if there's disagreement, if the employee feels that FCPS is being too restrictive, they would go to the.
Who's the appeal? So not only documentation of the ruling, but then is there an appeal process?
So the written agreement would be negotiated. And ultimately, you know, that's just something you're going to negotiate back and forth until you get to an agreement. The first question though, which is this something that we even need a written agreement on? If they cannot get to an agreement there, then you would apply for an advisory opinion to a panel.
That might be the superintendent's first recommendation.
Right.
Hey, let's first send this to the advisory panel and see, then we'll send it up.
Correct.
And the panel would be the ethics panel or a different panel?
So right now we have it in here as the ethics panel because we haven't created another. I am not 100% sold that that things like the decision over whether intellectual property is in the individuals or the employers belongs in front of the ethics panel, because I'm not sure that's within the scope of their purview. So we may need to tease that out as well.
We'll make sure also in the associated regulations that will go with this, that procedure is very clear.
That works. Thank you.
The remaining items are pulled from the policy 109 and some other places, which is again about not using confidential information in any proprietary way. You can't download a list of students or staff and email them and things like that. Fraud, waste, and abuse, again, is another policy that's typical. We have existing structures in place for reporting that. And then financial disclosure, this was a lift out from policy 109 and was placed here because this is the section relative to employees.
So let me jump in here
Yeah,
for
please.
just a second. I know one of the things the ethics panel is interested in discussing is whether all of the articulated individuals are required. The law does not specifically say curriculum specialist, buyer specialist, school psychologist.
Employees.
Right. It's broader than that in terms of what it's written into the law. And so I think the ethics panel, it wants to take a look at whether do we really need assistant principals to reply to do this, or do we need a supervisor or a coordinator?
And we talked about that. My recommendation, if it's permissible, is to just say this section applies to all employees that are required to report financial disclosures. So it's just being clear about who that is. Not every single person who works for us needs to do a financial disclosure. So we just need to tighten that list up.
This list encompasses about 375 employees. And that's in the scope of our overall, employment group, that's only about what?
Not many. We have
Not
about
many. Less than-
7,500 employees.
Right, that's like 5% of the employee population, but it's still 375, and
Your
that is
department
still a lot.
has to review all those, right?
They come to my department. I would like to say I did all of it. Ms. Marfizo, who's sitting in the back, who is my executive assistant extraordinaire, did a lot of that review, and then it goes to the ethics panel, and the ethics panel looks at them as well. So it's a lot.
Mhm. Again, it says that the board may grant exceptions if the board determines that there's not constituting any invasion of privacy or reduce anybody's ability. So sort of, Mr. Bass, to your question, I think we need to look at this. This sort of suggests that the board has an appeal body function. So this was something that lived in the other policy that we may want to revisit.
So ultimately, any decision of the superintendent could be appealed to the board, and because the ethics panel is a creature of the board. I mean, it's subordinate to you, but you are the ones who created it. You pick the individuals who serve on it. There is a review function for the board of ethics panel decisions as well.
Just sort of speak for that. It does outline about how to engage the ethics panel and what the forms are in the process for that. And then sort of has two sort of typical closing sentences, paragraphs here in sections 15, 16 about you don't violate this, there's a sanction for doing it. And that, if somebody is to make a report about a concern around a conflict of interest or ethics violation, there should be no retaliation. Again, some standard language.
Like I said when I started, I'm pretty excited. I think this is a pretty robust policy. Obviously, based on our discussion, we still have more work to do with it, but
it illustrates not only what a significant policy gap we had in this regard, but also the importance of sort of bringing everything together in one place. So it'll bring nepotism, fraud, waste, and abuse, royalties and copyright, all of that together into one policy because they're really all in the same. This is going to be an important anchor because in the hopeful adoption of this policy at some point in the coming months, this is the primary anchor for an employee code of conduct that we are working on. And so, employee codes of conduct are, as I described to my team, they're beautifully packaged information that exists in other places, right? Unto itself, it's not a policy, but it's a way of reference point for everyone in our organization as we're looking at system-wide onboarding and induction and some other pieces that are in the pipeline to say, this is what should govern how you make decisions on an employee. And there was a weak, as we were starting to work on that, we realized we had a weakness here. So, you know, we really appreciate and applaud the board for giving us a design opportunity to put this into play, and think that this will really fill a gap that we have as a system.
And that, so I sort of had two like broader questions that were not specific to any particular sections. One was, I think it would be helpful for us to know which policies that we're recommending deactivation into creating this. And Dr. Zerto, you just outlined
Yeah.
some of them, but I think it would be helpful for us and for the board to see which policies.
Which one, this comes in and that goes out, yeah.
Exactly. Just in a simple, and it might be part of the forms that we present anyways, as we're bringing this to the board. And then my second question was really about the broader employee code of conduct and how these two tie together. And so you really answered that question. I got that question about the student code of conduct as well, because we haven't gotten to the 400 series, which we talked about, which is really related to a lot of the student code of conduct. And so that one went out and has been updated and revised, and now we'll be looking at some policies that are related.
It'll help
So
us,
this,
yeah.
this one puts the horse before the cart, I think.
Yeah, and but was necessary because, you know, as we have our draft written of the employee code of conduct, you know, sort of the last page I have is like, here are all the source regulations and policies. You know, you can say whatever you want to say, but really at the end of the day, board policy and the law are the governing documents. So, you know, the reality is every year as an employer, we send out and say, hey, make sure you read all these, you're responsible for them. And we just know that the typical employee, I mean, we love the policies, but we don't know the typical employee is reading our board policies and regs. So we feel like as an employer, it's important for us to manage that message and package that information in a way that's consumable and supports the overall culture of civility, respect, ethics, all of those pieces that we expect to see in our organization.
The one thing that's not in here that we could easily put in here, because it is something that is typical of a policy, is a direction from the board to the superintendent to create a an employee code of conduct. I know that that's an interest that we've talked about, and I know that that's
She already
something
directed me to do it, so.
that Dr. Dyson wants done.
So-
Right, so I mean, we're doing it already, and so the board may say, well, we don't need to give an instruction to do something that we know you're already doing. That's kind of why I didn't include it. But if it is the board's interest in that there is a student code of conduct, this would be a mechanism. I'm sorry, an employee code of conduct. This would be a mechanism. We could add a section in here that says the board directs the superintendent to create an employee code of conduct consistent with this policy.
What I might offer, if I might, before the board responds to that is, because one of the conversations we're having is we're also working on an employee handbook so that we can systematize the experience of people when they get hired. And one of the things we're wrestling with is this sort of lives in, does this live inside of that, right? When you're an employee, you come into an organization and I'm saying sort of appropriately, we hand you the handbook. This is part of that. And so if I might suggest, if the board was to offer direction, it would be that the superintendent establish a system of annually communicating to employees what's in the policy. Because I don't know where we're going to, it may not be called the employee code of conduct at the end of the day. It could be, you know, just, it's going to be in a package. It could be in our employee handbook. It could be a separate standalone document. We're sort of playing with the delivery package. All of that will come before the board as well.
I just wanted to thank you for taking under, this is an enormous undertaking, and I want to thank you for clearly the work that's gone into this. So thank you.
And thank you for the questions, because I think it's going to make it a better
Oh, yeah.
policy. Sometimes you write policy and then you don't think about the what if scenario and you overly restrict something you didn't intend. So we want to make sure that we get it right.
100%.
This is part that makes me love policy too.
Yeah, good.
It's
Thank you.
important.
Welcome to our family.
Yeah.
So this was listed as an action.
Okay.
So it sounds like our action is that we're gonna do some additional
Make some
research and
refinements.
and then, yes.
And we'll bring it back.
To the policy committee before.
Yes.
Sound good?
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you, Dr. Zimmerman.
Yeah, but you don't need to.
Are we on time? Can we get you out of here?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
I'm gonna just listen
Good
in
luck.
for a few minutes.
All right, thank you.
So the next policy that we're bringing forward, we're going back in the agenda to 1.04, policy 300 personnel. This is a robust, updated personnel policy. It incorporates a number of policies that we've deactivated. And Ms. Gallagher, much the way you asked that we do for policy 305, you'll see in the red line version, there are these little yellow sticky notes. And if you pop up on the sticky note, you'll see that it tells you where the policy that we are inserting here lived originally. I was able to do that with this one as I was going, and I wish I had been able to do the same in 305. I'm really going to turn the floor over to Ms. Nguyen, our Director of Human Resources, because this is really a policy that lives with her.
Thank you. So as Mr. Blows mentioned, this policy incorporates the initial policy 300 for personnel. We incorporated the 303 attendance and absence, the 311 student teachers, 312 substitutes, and 320 support personnel. And then finally, 323, our support personnel discipline policy. So the first step was to really add some definitions that were referenced in all of those. So you'll see the updated definitions that are listed there. Made a few quick changes to our policy statement and then jumped into the implementation components of it. We identified terms of employment and really detailed out obviously the difference between our 12, 11, and 10-month positions, as well as anything part-time, and then finally our temporary positions. Then we worked down into probationary period, what that looks like for the different units. They are different for our certificated employees. Obviously, the tenure that they gain is defined there as their part of their probationary period. And then we move into support employees, and that ties back into each of their collective bargaining agreements. Instead of duplicating information, we want to cite it at the single source, so there's only one update to make. We did remove some of the language that was no longer consistent with our FACE agreement, and then detailed the probationary period as something that is the superintendent or designee's final decision on.
Can I stop you right there in the probationary period under BII? Was that something that was eliminated through negotiation?
That was something that was no longer part of our FACE agreement, so at some point it was, and we took that out to be consistent with it. That's kind of the issue you run into when you start citing pieces of a negotiated agreement. It's more places to update it. So we did reference all of our negotiated agreements at the bottom of this, since they are referenced throughout. Then we get into the appointments of employees. This initially came from our support personnel, so we kind of removed the support tie-in because really it does apply to all employees within our district.
That's going to be a common theme you're going to hear, is that we're taking something that was written as policy for support employees, but really applies to everyone, and there's no reason why it's just support employees.
Yeah.
Or they appreciate that not be singled out.
Similar with salary, again, took the notion that was just applied to support employees out of there, made it applicable to all of our employees, and again, tied it back to their collective bargaining agreements or appropriate salary scales for our AMT staff. Again, similar with the dismissal piece of it, made that applicable to all of our employees. Evaluation, very similar to that, tied it back to the collective bargaining agreements. Or board policy 309, which governs our AMT staff.
319.
Or, I'm sorry, 319. Personnel records, that was pretty plain, didn't have to do many updates, but brought it into this policy for consistency. Again, insurance, same thing, not just applicable to our support employees, but all of our employees. And then tied it back to the appropriate collective bargaining agreement or our board policy 319. Terminal pay, similar with that, doesn't just apply to our support employees, applies to all, so we made that update. Similar with workers' compensation, leave from their assignment, And then when we did bring the policy in for support employees, you can see that there is number 12. We did have one update as far as linking the policy, the regulation for 100-05 for our auxiliary custodians. We brought in substitute teachers with a minor change, just talking about the superintendent assigning employment of substitutes where they're needed or where they're required in a classroom. Our student teachers and interns brought this into the policy. It was previously in another piece of it, in another policy. And then you could see the update that we provided regarding the workers' compensation law that also applies to them. Code of conduct, that got a little facelift as well. We made that applicable to all employees and then took out some language in there for clarity's sake. And then we did get down into listing a non-exhaustive list of behaviors that may result.
Before we go into the non-exhaustive list, I just want to focus on, for 1 second, on something we eliminated out of 15B. The latter half of the paragraph where we struck the examples of behavior are listed below. We've got the list, we don't need that. But what's more important to me is that that last full sentence: support employees may be disciplined or terminated for other actions and behaviors not on the list, which in the opinion of supervisory staff are unacceptable. That was so vague and amorphous and empowering of the supervisor and disempowering of the staff that, in discussing it, we didn't know how that language could stay in there anymore. And I wanted to just highlight that as one of the changes we made to recognize that we want the discipline and the code of conduct to be really fairly and equitably approached by the system.
I appreciate that. I can see where that would lead to incredible inconsistency.
Which is too subjective.
Yeah.
It was up to each manager, and at times you want to have consistency in employee discipline, and we've done some work on that recently. So this kind of counteracted what we were trying to do in implementing that consistency. And as Mr. Gillis mentioned, then we get down into a list, which is not exhaustive, but does include some examples of behaviors into the different categories of unsatisfactory work performance.
And these are all pre-existing. We did not create any of these. These are in the current policy for support personnel discipline.
Violations against person, against property, against public decency and good morals, violations against public health and safety, against the Board of Education or its policies and procedures, and then violations while operating board vehicles or operating a personal vehicle.
And I think we had some discussion when we reviewed this prior around this non-exhaustive list of behaviors. This comes from COMAR. This is from the law. Is that legally these are things that
I admit I did not bump it up against COMAR to ensure that everything that's listed is identified in COMAR, but I can make sure that we're not, that if we're pulling anything that's not from COMAR, that we have a good reason for that.
We could actually pull the list and put it into our employee code of conduct. That would be a better option. It's hard to get into detail every single instance that can happen. Obviously, we want to make sure the ones from COMAR are part of that, but then there are others that get into the more ethical pieces that are not necessarily illegal components.
Yeah, and I brought this up before, but there's still vagueness in here, right? So you look at the violations against public decency and good morals, and you have like misconduct and immorality. Some people's definitions of this, we talked about this before. Some people's definitions of what might be immoral.
So those two are specifically identified in COMAR, and then we have the school law desk book that provides specific examples of what they look like. Because, when you talk about morality, yours could look different than mine, and supervisors could look different than their employees. So we follow the legal guidance that has been provided in those.
My
Is this referenced like down at the end here?
Yeah, well, yeah. this is
Okay,
a-
I'm just saying, so,
Yeah,
because that question will come up for, I think, most people on that.
when we were working
Morality
on,
could be
yeah.
Very
Well, when we
subjective.
were working on it, my initial thought was I just grabbed it all and did a strike through. But then I thought, maybe we should have a discussion with the board. I mean, as Ms. Nguyen worked on this very directly, we really wanted to bring that to you. If you were to ask us our recommendation, we would recommend pulling this. And just, referencing what is in COMAR generally, which are the 5 reasons that you can be terminated or disciplined, and not getting into the 7 shades of ways that this could look. Because every single disciplinary circumstance is so unique. And, it's not even just a particular behavior. We look at patterns, we look at progressive discipline. So, 2 people doing the same thing could have different disciplinary outcomes based on other factors. So it would be my recommendation, if the board would be okay with it, to remove it, because it's not policy language.
To remove the whole list.
Just like the reasons from COMAR, and then include the list more in the employee code of conduct.
Well, that was gonna be my second
Right.
question was, and obviously you mentioned progressive discipline, so if there is a violation of, one of them, there is obviously, unless it's an egregious
Correct.
offense, that
Yeah,
typically we would work.
We try to match his level of offense with their level of
The same
response.
way we did with the student code of conduct, there is a progression
Correct.
of progressive.
As Mr. Thornburg said, we try not to use a sledgehammer on a gnat, right? That's, he's the best metaphor.
But then can you direct us to the 5 offenses that are mentioned in COMAR?
I think it's earlier, it's earlier. It's they're going, I think it's earlier. Next page. It's right here. And,
So it's under, I'm sorry, page 3, under 5 dismissal. Immorality, misconduct in office, insubordination, incompetence, and willful neglect of duty.
So immorality is in COMAR.
Correct.
And there are examples defined in the school law textbook that has been provided.
So it's sort of the general notion of what is unacceptable for the standard of the work and the community. It's not a list like there are examples, but you have to.
But as you pointed out, since this is already mentioned here, we could
Right,
strike it from-
we don't need to give you 17 ways in which immorality might look.
Right.
Right?
Would some of that though move to regulation?
We could. The regulation really should govern our process and we have a draft of like, how do we engage in due process and progressive discipline? How do we, do some of these other things around hiring and things like that? But I'll say we've done a lot of work, the 3 of us this year, on standardizing our system-wide approach to due process and progressive discipline. Mr. Wedge and Mr. Thornburg have been doing training of all of our administrators and supervisors. And we really are bringing all of that now back under human resources, as this policy really directly indicates. Previous to that, supervisors could make decisions about employment for employees without any involvement of HR. And so support employees specifically didn't have any appeal rights to the board. So the only ones that were coming before the board were teachers, perhaps. But we're bringing all of that through. We have a structure that we are going to bring into the regulation to make that visible. This is our process. This is what a supervisor can discipline. This is what is centrally managed. This is the role of legal services. This is the role of HR. This is the role of the board, so that it's standardized and everyone will have the same experience. And give a lot of credit to Ms. Nguyen for her effort in leading that work.
So we're good to move the list out. Do you feel comfortable with that?
I think so.
We'll just cite those 5.
Yes.
Then we get down into disciplinary actions. Again, this was a policy initially directed only toward our support personnel and should really cover all staff. So we made those changes, but we also kind of added some information about the application of progressive discipline. We've done a lot of work this year, as Dr. Sordo mentioned. in our office to create that consistency, to share it with some of our administrators. In fact, we've had training with them to kind of manage what happens at the school level, what is centrally managed, and we've shared that plan with our association partners so that they understand a more consistent application.
This is another one of those sections that is, I think, of particular significance, because here's where you're telling the employees, this is the board's interest is in progressive discipline.
Then we get into the administrative leave with pay section. This was previously part of our support, but really does govern all staff based upon the need to investigate. We made a few language changes about implementing it when their factors are necessary, but not limited to. So really, the implementation of administrative leave is dependent upon the allegations, the required reporting period. If we have to report to Child Protective Services, that staff member has to be put out on leave. And then it kind of gets down into the process of, weighing through the evidence, the benefits of removing the employee, and what that looks like. Question?
And to some degree, the administrative leave with pay can also be used to protect the employee. It's not just we're taking you out, you've done something wrong. It can be used in a way that's to protect the employee, to avoid them from being harassed by a supervisor who is upset that they are being challenged on the discipline being issued.
We try to have those conversations with employees, saying this is not looked at as disciplinary. It's just an opportunity to provide some space. So that way we can get in and look at the components of what occurred to really determine what happened. Sometimes these investigations can be very emotional, so we just want to make sure that there's sometimes a level of separation. I've also seen some instances where if the teacher remains in the classroom, the parent phone call could accidentally be transferred, and then now you've got the confrontation between the parent who made the allegations and the staff member who is being investigated for what occurred. So having that level of separation would be important.
The last thing that I would note is, this may be the most robust section of related information and related regulations that you're going to see. And as much as we are deactivating, there are still a lot of cross references for our personnel, for our administration of our personnel.
Might we list here deactivated policies?
We could list deactivated policies, but they're deactivated. So once the board has, removed them from play, they're really no longer necessarily relevant other than as a historical reference. Yeah.
I just looked for the language there. I looked at it under F, policy history. Thought, might we just list deactivated policies? Just a sentence saying following policies were deactivated, and yes, in creation of.
So one of the things that I and my team have been working on is an update to the website where to reflect a designated place for people to community staff, whomever, to see the changes that the board has made. And so when that goes live, and I've got a meeting scheduled with our public affairs team to help with the actual administration of the website. What it will be, in my vision at least, is a link that you go to that pops up a list that says Board Policy 300 revised whatever date 2023, and then in the notes there's a capture of all of the things that were done, and that would include incorporation of policy 303, 307, whatever the list was that Ms. Nguyen listed. And then on that same document, you would see Board Policy 312, support personnel deactivated and incorporated into 300. So we're trying to build something that gives that visibility, but doesn't necessarily put it in the policy itself. And my hesitation is, I don't want to clutter up the policy with history. And that history, right now it's short, right? Because we're creating it now. But eventually that's going to be long. And to have a long policy history to follow, I think, that presents a challenge, I think. So if there are no other questions, the recommendation is that we move this to the board for approval, subject to the changes that we've discussed, and some other typos that I caught as I was looking through it. The pulling the list of the behaviors out of that section really is the one piece.
So we do the for third reading.
Correct. Great. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
for coming.
Yes, thank you. Another great work.
So fortunately, the rest of our agenda is relatively brief. We do have policy 317, royalties and copyright, but as I think you can probably guess, the proposal is to deactivate because we've incorporated that into policy 305. And so I will, I'll ask the board, or the panel, can we, or the committee, can we move this forward to the board as part of that package? The next two items on the agenda, 1.08 and 1.09, are policy 200, school attendance areas and redistricting, and policy 501, curriculum distribution. I'm going to treat both of them together. Policy 200 was discussed at our meeting on August 30th. Policy 501 was discussed in our meeting on July 26th. Dr. Lebo and Dr. Cuppet, respectively, have both asked for additional time to continue to work on the revisions that were discussed with this committee. I have said that's, I am comfortable with that, and I have placed it on the agenda for our next meeting. And so they will hopefully be able to be present with the changes that they're recommending for them at the next meeting. For both of those, 200 and 501.
Okay, makes good sense to me. I was not at the July meeting. I was away, and I don't know, is there a high level summary of what Dr. Cuppet is looking at with policy 501?
Yes, and I'd be happy to sit down and talk with you offline about what was discussed. You can always also go back and rewatch the session because it is posted, the video is posted to Board Docs, and as are the minutes. But I'd be happy to sit down with you offline and just talk you through what was discussed.
Sure.
So that brings us to the last item on the agenda, and this is going to be a fun one. And that is, what approach does this committee want to take with respect to the Policy 400 series? It's a big series. There's 35 policies. And as today indicated, we went through 3 substantive policies and it took us almost an hour and 40 minutes. That's a lot of time because we've been doing a lot of work. And with 35 policies under the 400 series to review, I think we need to have a clear path on the approach that the panel or that the committee and the board wants to take. So I have 4 possible methodologies that I can suggest, and we can talk about others. And let me just throw these out there for you and see what if any of these are of interest for you. The first is simple sequential order. You start at 400, you work your way through all the way down to 446, one at a time in the order that they're presented. The second approach is to take a look through the lens of which policies are the oldest. When were they last updated? We have several. The oldest policy, I believe, in this series dates back to March of 2006. So almost for the last updated. They don't always reflect whether they were reviewed or not. So I didn't want to go by a review date because I just don't know without going through 20 years of history of policy committee meetings, of board meetings, when was the last time they were actually reviewed. Some say it, some don't. But to have policies that date back to 2006 and haven't been updated suggests that they need a good, clean, fresh look because likely things have changed. The world is a bit different than from 2006. So age is an approach we could take. We could approach this through subject area. There are policies within the 400 series that kind of lump together. So student conduct, that would be policy 403, discipline, policy 404, student rights and responsibilities, policy 407, removal of students from school area, policy 408, suspension and expulsion. Those all kind of group together under this common notion of student conduct. And then there are other policies that may also fit into that group. But I think we could go through and group them together that way. The fourth approach that we could come up with is by who's responsible for the implementation of those policies. So, for example, legal services, my office, we really would be the ones looking at and taking care of policy 400, systematic delegation of duties, policy 425, flag display and salute, policy 427, religious expression. Those are all really housed within my office. My office is the one that will be doing the work on updating those policies. Curriculum instruction and innovation would be looking at policy 409, promotion of health and wellness of students, policy 414, field trips and overnight travel study program, policy 432, guest speakers, policy 436, school-sponsored publications and media student journalists. There will be overlap. That last policy, that has a legal implication as well. And so my office would be involved as well in that. But the idea being, those are all curriculum instruction and innovation related policies. I can go through all of them and capture them the same way, with whether it's SASA or operations or I can come up with groupings in that way if that's the approach the committee wants to take. Those are my 4 ideas, certainly open to others.
I lean towards the oldest, right? Those that haven't been reviewed or updated in many years. I would support having our first look at those.
I would eliminate option 1, sequential. When you offer the other 3, that one doesn't make any sense at all. Could we do a blending of first being oldest, but then encapsulating related?
You mean related by subject area?
Yeah. I'm just throwing that out.
Yeah. I can sort and organize this however you would like me to.
It seems like that would make sense. You pick the oldest, and then that oldest one, we take care of those policies that are related to it, so that our conversation is around that area. That's that, yeah, that makes good sense.
Okay. So I will work on a roadmap, and I can bring that roadmap back to the policy committee for the next meeting. Here's what I have on the agenda for the next session already. It's already a pretty robust list. So policy 101 for information and discussion, because Mr. Basson, I apologize to you because you had asked that this be put on today's agenda and I missed it in my notes.
We had quite the robust agenda, and I didn't send my thoughts to the committee, so no worries.
So, but it will be on the agenda for the October 25th session. 109 and 305 are coming back from today's discussion. 200 and 501 are coming back from the previous sessions. So we've already got 5 policies to talk about at the next session. I think adding here's the roadmap I've come up with, and then starting that roadmap with the session in November probably makes a lot of sense.
I like that, right? Yep.
So that is all of the items on today's agenda. Hopefully this evening we will get 114 approved and we can start bundling and bringing back policies to the board. I know that there's been some discussion about setting an additional work session where we can just focus on knocking out some of the policies.
Yes. That was emailed to the board yesterday.
Yeah, and I think before we conclude on that particular topic, I think for our committee to also think about how we might propose to the full board particularly as we're moving quickly through some of these policies, maybe looking at a quarterly policy-focused work session for the full board until we can sort of get caught up on the work that we've been doing here, because we've been moving and it's been a little bit slower for the board. So I know we've already added one work session in October, but just wondering about the potential for us to consider that long term, at least for the next term.
Yeah, we actually had the discussion about adding the extra one in October that'll be purely focused on getting those policies that are backed up moving. And then we discussed possibly at some point lengthening work session.
To incorporate
To
time
incorporate
for,
more time for policy.
and
Because this is important and there's recognition of that across.
yeah, and there are some, we talked today about one gap in our policy, in our set of policies, 305, and that we are filling. There are others, and I will tell you that my team has been hard at work on a document retention policy that we do not have, that COMAR requires us not only to have, but to review every 2 years. And so we are working on developing that. We've been reaching out to other departments that have a big stake in the discussion of policy, of document retention. But my goal, my hope is to bring that to this panel in December, so we can get it in front of the board in January. Policy 105 appeal, that's the appeals and hearings process. I think that needs an overhaul. And I've been doing some work on overhauling that so I can present that, because there's things that are not in there that I think need to be in there. Not the least of which is the opportunity to refer matters to hearing officers, which is provided for under law, but is not addressed in the policy.
Because we talked about that.
We talked about it being updated, but it was.
As a board, we determined that the language in the current policy, it gave us leeway.
But there's not, but it's not specific. It was pre-me,
Yeah.
and I think there was some work done by my predecessor on drafting revisions, and it just never, it hasn't made its way yet to it, because when I took over, I focused on the 300 series with Ms. Nguyen and Dr. Sergo, because that's where we were supposed to be working on. But 105 is still in my head, and I have tabs on my computer that never close because they're there to remind me, find time, come back, fix this. But the point being, there's a lot more policies that are going to be coming in addition to the 400 series. So if we can get those work sessions, those quarterly work sessions, to help move that along, that would be, I think, a wonderful step.
So I think it's either quarterly only policy focused work sessions or strategically extending some of our work sessions, which might be challenging in terms of schedule.
I understood.
So, but I do think that we will continue to have a backlog if we don't add in some additional time with the full board to give us that.
100%.
I think that's right. The only additional thing we haven't discussed is we will probably need to schedule a policy committee meeting for December. Right now, there's none on the calendar. Should we look now at December 13th? Yeah, should we look now at December 13th or Wednesday morning?
So it's a non-board meeting Wednesday. Whatever.
It may be that that's if that fits people's calendars, it may be that that's a good day to do a virtual session. So we don't need to worry about the room space. We had some success this summer with a virtual session. So it may be that that's a good opportunity. Not that we've had heavy winters recently, but you never know in December what the weather's going to look like. That just may be something to think about.
Well, that might give an opportunity for public comment, what we saw last time we held.
Yeah,
a
sure. Yeah.
policy committee meeting. So I would be in favor of that.
So the 13th would work for me.
So.
Yeah, we'll make it. Yes. We, and by me, you mean Ms. Marfizo. Sitting in the back, yes, we will,
Communicate that to Catherine and
we will make the arrangements to get that up on, on everyone's calendars and posted for the public as aware.
Yeah, I appreciate particularly this discussion because I think it points to the public when we talking about meeting our requirements within our new policy 114, why we're implementing a time frame that to some might seem broad. But when you look at like this next list, 101, 109, 305, 200, 501, and then the 400 roadmap, that's what our agenda looks like always. Because there are always policies cycling through that due to regulation change, law change, right here in our system changes.
Yep.
They're going to circumvent us getting to our order. So that's, it's not so simple as just saying, oh, going to do the 400 this month and we're done.
Right.
It's just not that simple. So I think it's important for us to say that there's a lot of work here. We're pushing 2 hours.
And we accomplished a lot,
Yes,
but there's a lot of work still to be done.
yes. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Anything else for the cause?
No, I look forward to seeing you all this evening,
Yes.
So, then we-
afternoon this evening.